So they asked me to talk about the utilization of corn stalk residues, which, as Dr. Berger indicated, is a huge component of our production systems in Nebraska. And so I wanted to just start a little bit by taking a couple quick looks at some things related to the beef cow inventory. And I know that both Don and Rick touched on this a little bit yesterday. But you know, when we take a look at this beef cow inventory, obviously we're all very well aware of the changes that have happened here, especially over the last 15 to 20 years. But I thought it'd be good to just kind of hone in on a couple more things on more of a local or a more regional level, kind of aside from the national changes that we've seen. So if you were to take a look at it here with this north central region of states that I have outlined here in the map, and this would include obviously the northern Great Plains and basically the upper Midwest regions of the United States. And if we go back and we take a look at the beef cow inventories back in 2006, on a national basis, we were right at about 33.3 million beef cows, okay? And the cows that resided in this part of the country numbered about 11.1 million. And these are some numbers that Dr. Jim McDonald up at Nebraska put together, and so maybe you've maybe already seen these once or twice, but I thought it would be really good to revisit that for the purposes of this discussion. So when we jump up here to about 2011, we can see that overall in the United States we're running about 30.8 million, and in that north central region of the country we're at about 10 million. So during this time period from 06 to 11, about 50% basically of that total cow herd reduction that occurred in the United States happened within this specific region. The reason I think it's important to take a look at this is because that's pre-drought, right? So that's before we had 10 and 11 down here, and then obviously 12, which basically impacted everybody. So I think this kind of helps indicate and suggest a little bit that there's some other things going on here. And this is the exact same slide that Rick showed you guys yesterday, but I thought it's very, very important to take a look at this. So when we look at Nebraska and then the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Iowa, we can see that this data from Wright and Wimberly there in 2013, very good study, shows that there's a little over 1.3 million acres converted from pasture and rangeland. Actually, this would be total grassland, so that would be anything that's in wetlands or native hay production, anything like that, that's been converted over to corn and soybean production. So this issue of land use conversion for us in the northern Great Plains is very, very important, which is why we're all here at a conference talking about alternative methods and ways to manage beef cows in confinement. When we look at this map, I just want to point out that these areas that are in the yellow or in the red are the areas where that change or that conversion was the most intense or the most concentrated. So I think it's really interesting when we look at areas like southwestern Iowa, south central Iowa, western Iowa. The big one to me that really stands out is that change that's occurred up in the Dakotas. I find that very interesting, but quite a few acres that have been taken out and converted into corn and bean production for various reasons. And it's obviously not surprising, and this is the exact same graph that Rick showed you yesterday. But again, as we see, it's not surprising to any of us that those pasture rental rates have increased over time. Now, of course, inflation has contributed to that, but we can see that increase in pasture rental rates and costs associated with that. This is again on a southeast Nebraska basis. It was a pretty slow increase for about 20 years, and then it's really gone up exponentially basically over the last 10. It's pretty much doubled in the last 10 years. So when we think about putting together cow budgets and analyzing our total cow costs, this has obviously changed a great deal in the last several years. So corn production is increasing, right? No surprise to any of us. Don showed us that again yesterday, and Rick talked about that as well. We see corn production is increasing overall on a national basis every year. It's amazing how much corn we can produce in this country when you really get down to it. So if corn production is increasing, right, and acres are being converted from grass and native pasture into corn and soybean production, that actually leaves us with an increase in forage supply that is produced as a result of the residue from grain crop production. This is pretty critical for us because it really, in the Midwest and in the major corn production areas, it really represents the only source of forage that is increasing for us on an annual basis. Now it's interesting because as I say that, we have a year like we did this year and everybody's got hay sitting around everywhere, right? I mean, there's hay all over the country just due to the abundant moisture that we've had. But when you look at it over time, as these data clearly indicate, that available residue is increasing. So I think you can view this really as either from one of two different angles. You can view it from, it can either be a challenge or an opportunity depending on how you want to take a look at it. I think those of us at our research group, as Dr. Berger indicated, very much view this as an opportunity for our producers and for our systems to be able to look at opportunities to utilize this residue. And that's why you're seeing such a large emphasis on the part of our research group taking a look at this. So how can we utilize these residues more efficiently to improve the overall efficiency of these beef production systems? This whole issue with how corn production and corn price is tied with forage production and specifically the production of traditional forages, that whole issue is going to be pretty important, we think, for the beef industry going forward. And Don talked about that a little bit as well yesterday. That poll, I thought, from where everybody was from yesterday afternoon was pretty interesting. Obviously, there are many of you that are from areas that are not located in the major corn production areas. My comment regarding to that is obviously corn and soybean production are the major crops that we're really wanting to take a look at. But grain sorghum production for you folks here in the Southern Plains is obviously an important component of your crop production systems. So my talk today is obviously going to focus on corn residue because that's what's the most important for us in Nebraska. But a lot of the same concepts and fundamentals with grain sorghum apply to corn residue as well. So I just want you folks to keep that thing in mind, that as we talk about how to utilize corn residues and these different methods in which we might approach it, a lot of the same concepts and fundamentals apply for grain sorghum as well. And quite frankly, I think it's one that we probably need to keep our eye on. You know, it's interesting when you look at the overall composition in terms of nutrient value of grain sorghum residue. Obviously, we know that the grain itself is pretty high quality, about 10.5% crude protein, and it's obviously a very good source of energy. When we look at the leaf material from that grain sorghum residue, we can see that it runs about 10% crude protein. It's going to vary, of course, like anything else, but the digestibility of it, when we look at dry matter digestibility, is actually quite high. And so the stock material actually is quite high as well when we're looking at the mid-50s in terms of dry matter digestibility. So that's actually pretty comparable to good quality grass hay. So just want to keep that thing in mind. Again, I'm going to talk mainly about corn residue production. That's our major emphasis in Nebraska. There's some other resources out there that I think, depending on your locale, you probably need to at least keep in mind or think about as well. Okay. So when we start talking about utilizing corn residue, and I'm not trying to get too elementary with this, but I think it's a really important discussion for us to have. When we start talking about utilizing corn residue, there's some things I think we need to cover first. And this first thing is understanding that just like any other plant, the parts from those plants are going to vary. They're going to differ depending on what part or what component of the plant that you're talking about. And the reason why this is important is because that influences nutritional quality, or that influences overall diet quality, right? So when we take a look at the corn plant itself on a dry matter basis, when we look at the husk material, that represents about 7% or between 6 and 7% of the total plant material on a dry matter basis. The leaf blade represents about 22%. And then the leaf sheath, which is that component that wraps around the stem, represents about 11% of that plant material on a dry matter basis. These three components here, the husk, the leaf blade, as well as the leaf sheath, are those components that we're the most interested in when we talk about utilizing residue. That's what we want to target. And when we combine those three, they represent about 40% of the total plant material on a dry matter basis. So the cob represents about 12%, 11 to 12%, and then the stem or the stalk represents the other 50%. So those lower quality components represent about 60 combined, and those higher quality components, the husk, the leaf blade, and the leaf sheath, which have the most value for us in beef cattle diets, represent about 40% of that total plant material on a dry matter basis. So what do they eat? Well, they're cows. They're going to eat anything, right, if you give them the opportunity. But we want them to eat the husk, the leaf blade, as well as the leaf sheath. Those are the components we're the most interested in. If you take a look at it per bushel of grain produced, on a dry matter basis, there's about 2.6 or 2.5 pounds of husk material produced. There's a little over 8 to about 9 pounds of leaf blade material. And then there's about 4 pounds of sheath produced. And again, that's per bushel of grain yield. So when we combine those components, our estimates pretty consistently suggest there's anywhere from 15 to 16 pounds on a dry matter basis of leaf and husk material produced, and that's per bushel of grain yield. This becomes really important when we start talking about calculating stocking rate, and because that influences the proportion of those plant parts that are consumed. And basically these data would have been collected by hand harvesting individual plant components, physically breaking them down by hand and looking at the differences there. So there's a lot of graduate students that over the course of several years would have taken a look at that. Adam McGee, who's sitting in the back, I believe, when he was working on his master's in Nebraska a couple of years ago, did quite a bit of work looking at the digestibilities or the overall diet qualities of those different plant components that are presented from us, obviously from the corn plant itself. And so they found that when you take a look at it, obviously the top and he separated out the stem into the top 1/3 and the bottom 2/3. But he found that the top 1/3 of that corn plant, of the stalk of that corn plant, is pretty lowly digestible, about 37%. The bottom 2/3 is actually even poor. So again, that stalk component is pretty low quality forage in the mid to lower 30s for digestibility. They found that the leaf material was about 45% digestible. The leaf sheath was maybe just a little bit lower at 38%. But they found that the husk material was actually pretty highly digestible at about 60%, which is better than many different grass hays that we might be able to take a look at on a yearly basis. The shank was about 50%, and then that cob, again, pretty similar to the stem at about 34% digestible. So when we take a look at this again, I just want to emphasize that those different components of the corn plant have different digestibilities. That influences diet quality, which influences animal performance. Another important concept I think we need to talk about, or at least bring up when we start talking about utilizing corn residue from the standpoint of grazing corn stalks, is that it's just like winter range, right? So we're not going to have any new growth throughout the grazing season. There's not going to be any improvement in terms of overall forage quality. So whatever quality and quantity of corn residue that we have at the beginning of the grazing season is that's what we've got to work with. It just slowly declines from there, right? This is some work that Casey Wilson did in Nebraska a few years ago, but they looked at overall digestibility. These are diet samples of calves that were grazing corn stalks, and we can see that at the start of that grazing period, the overall digestibility or the diet quality is relatively high at between 60 and 70%. You can see that it declines fairly rapidly, so by the time you get out to about 2 months into the grazing season, that diet quality has declined down to into the mid to upper 40s. So overall, on average, we're probably in that 50 to 55% digestibility, but again, it's going to depend on stocking rate as well. So just an important concept, that diet quality decreases over time. And so we need to remember that when we're calculating stocking rates and approaching these different ways in which we can utilize corn residue. So how do we calculate stocking rate? I think if you were to ask most people, they're going to say, oh, well, it's just so many acres per cow for however long time period. I mean, most guys, when they take a look at how they calculate stocking rates on corn stalks, my guess is you're probably not going to get a real scientific answer in terms of how they calculate stocking rate, right? it's very clear that residue yield is directly proportional to grain yield. Okay, so as yields go up in terms of grain production, that residue is going to increase as well. So our data, as I indicated, suggests pretty strongly that there's somewhere between 15 to 16 pounds of leaf and husk material produced per bushel of grain yield. Now our stocking rate recommendations are to only remove about 50% of that material. So we're only going to take off about 8 pounds of that leaf and husk material, okay? So we're only going to remove 50% just of the leaf and husk. Now, if we go through an example here, if we've got a field that yields 150, okay, and so if it makes 150 and there's 8 pounds of dry matter per bushel of grain yield produced, that's 1,200 pounds of leaf and husk material per acre. If we've got a 1,200 pound cow out there and she's in mid to late gestation, she's eating 2% of her body weight on a dry matter basis, that's 24 pound a day dry matter intake. So with this math and with this logic, 1 acre could run utilize when we talk about how we calculate stocking rate. Now, I think another important concept that we need to talk about, or at least bring up, that many people have is, okay, well, how much residue are you really taking off? Okay, and that's a big concern and something that we really need to take a close look at. So if we only take off 8 pounds of that leaf and husk material, and at the most, if it's 60% digestible, we're really only taking off about 4 to 5 pounds of residue on a dry matter basis, okay? Now I said that there was 15 to 16 pounds of leaf and husk material produced, but that's not total residue, right? That's just the leaf and husk. There's somewhere between 40 to 45 pounds of total residue that's produced on a dry matter basis when you add in all those other components. So when we graze at this stocking rate to only remove about 8 pounds, in terms of the total residue that's coming off that field, we're only taking off 10 to 11% at the very most, okay? It's an important concept, especially as we talk about grazing corn stalks with corn grain producers, agronomists. These are the kinds of things that we need to be discussing, and that we're taking a very close look at Nebraska, because that influences whether or not, quite frankly, corn stalks are grazed. And so this is a pretty big issue. With our data would strongly suggest, though, the total amount of residue that we're taking off is quite low. So do we need to supplement beef cattle on corn stalks? Pretty basic question, but it's going to depend, right? Depends on if we're talking about a gestating cow versus a fall calving cow that's lactating, that has a calf inside if we're grazing stocks in the fall and winter, versus a growing calf. And obviously each of those situations is going to vary, and it's going to depend. As I've already alluded to, stocking rate's really going to be a big driver of diet quality, and that influences overall animal performance. But of course, winter weather is a big wild card for us in the northern plains, and that really is going to influence animal performance as well. That obviously is going to dictate whether or not we might need to supplement in certain situations. Body condition score of those cows going into the grazing period, as well as expected performance if we're looking at calves that are managed in a backgrounding program, if we've got calves after weaning grazing corn stalks, depending on what our desired performance level is with that situation, that's going to influence whether or not we need to supplement as well. But I think one of the most important things we need to talk about is that cattle are selective grazers, right? And so as I talked about how that diet quality decreases over time, it's because cattle are selective in terms of how they graze. So obviously, they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for. They're going to go after that residual grain that's left over in the field, and we know very clearly if it's there, they're going to find it. So that's the first thing, obviously, that they're going to go after, and then they'll consume the husk and leaf material next. And finally, if those cows are forced to, they will consume the cob and stem. We don't ever want to put them in a situation where they're having to do that, right? So we want to make sure that we're appropriately calculating stocking rate. And if we use that 8-pound rule, our data would suggest pretty clearly that we're never going to put ourselves into that situation. So again, cattle are pretty selective. Whether or not we need to supplement is really going to depend on what our objectives are. These are some data that Jim McDonald and Ben Tibbetts put together at Nebraska here just recently. This is a 3-trial summary of the response for calves grazing irrigated corn residue to dried distillers grain supplementation. So when we think about managing calves in a backgrounding program after weaning, when we look at the response here, we can see that as we increase the supplementation rate from about 0.3 up to 1.1% of body weight on a dry matter basis, we get a very nice response here in terms of average daily gain. And so obviously for weaned calves or replacement heifers grazing corn stalks after weaning, they're going to require some supplementation in order to achieve an acceptable body weight gain. So that's what the data would suggest for calves in that type of forage program. With regards to whether or not we need to supplement beef cows grazing corn stalks, these are some data that were collected with a cow herd in eastern Nebraska a few years ago. So these are spring calving cows that were grazing during the latter stages of gestation. They would have been during mid to late gestation, grazing irrigated corn stalks, and those cows were either not supplemented or they were supplemented with about a little over 2 pounds per head per day on a dry matter basis of a distiller's grains based cube. We can see from these data that although it wasn't numerically different, or wasn't statistically different, excuse me, we can see that those cows that were supplemented had a greater change in terms of body weight during that supplementation period from October to February. We did actually observe a change in terms of body condition score. Was statistically different. Those cows that were supplemented had a greater change in body condition score from October to February. But when we look at in terms of the percentage of those females that were cycling prior to the start of the breeding season, as well as overall pregnancy rates, they were not different between these two groups of cows. There was no difference in terms of calving interval. And when we look a little bit at some calf performance variables, there was no difference in terms of calf birth weight or calf weaning weight in this study. And I would like to point out that this study was replicated over, I think, 5 years, and there was about 150 cows total in that study per year. So there's I think there's about 750 head of cows total in this study across that time period. But the other thing I really want to emphasize with these data is that the cows in this study were managed to be an appropriate body condition score of 5 or better prior to the start of the grazing season during the fall. But they were also managed to be in a body condition score 5 or greater at the start of calving season. And so we might not see a lot of response to supplementation from cows that are managed to be in an appropriate body condition score at calving, as well as cows that are appropriately stocked. And so in this study, those cows would have been stocked using that 8 pound of dry matter residue rule that I talked about. So I think the main take home here is that for a mature gestating beef cow that's appropriately stocked in good body condition, we may not necessarily need to supplement that cow in some situations. So as Rick talked about yesterday and alluded to, and he showed very clearly that utilizing corn stalk residues for us in Nebraska is very economical. And he showed how if we can incorporate corn stalks into a dry lot system, that decreases our overall production costs and has the potential to be a more profitable system for us overall, right? And that's really the objective, or that's really the new focus that we've got at Nebraska, is to look at how we can combine a dry lot system with utilizing residue. It's really a no-brainer for us, guys. I mean, it's extremely simple. It works very well. So again, we've been taking a look at utilizing summer calving cows in our system, right? And when we started this study, when we started this research on dry lot cows in general a couple of years ago, we went to a summer calving system as opposed to calving in the traditional February, March, April timeframe. And we did that really for 2 reasons. One, to get out of the mud and get out of some tough pen conditions that we were anticipating to be present at that time of the year. But also in terms of when those calves are weaned in these summer-born systems or in these fall calving systems, those calves are weaned at a different time point, so they're weaned the following spring. So when you look at overall market trends, that might be a time of the year when those calves there's a greater, stronger market price for feeder calves at that time of the year. And those calves can also go into a summer grazing program, or they can also be put directly on feed. So we've got some different flexibility in terms of marketing options there. So those were the 2 main reasons that we looked at going to more of a summer calving season when we started this research. So in terms of looking at it with how we can combine grazing corn stalks, do we have the opportunity to just leave that calf on the cow and graze corn stalks all winter long, as opposed to early weaning, and that's what we're starting to take a look at here. Now, for those of you in the Southern Plains, and Oklahoma State has done quite a bit of work on this. There's obviously a lot more data on fall calving. That's obviously much more common in this part of the country than it is in the Northern Plains. And so really, when you take a look at it, the overall data that we've got on summer calving cows that would be managed throughout the winter with calves at side, we're pretty limited on that really in Nebraska. But there was actually some work done out at the North Platte Station in conjunction with those at the Gudmundsson Sandhills lab up in the Sandhills. And they looked at a system where they were looking at summering or wintering August-born pairs on corn stalks, and they found in that study that those cows actually lost some body weight, and they lost one full body condition unit during that fall grazing period, and those calves gained about 1.75 pounds a day throughout the entire wintering period. So that kind of gives us a basis for what we might anticipate or what we might expect with our system that we're starting to take a look at. So the first 2 years we've looked at early weaning. But this past year, we've switched our treatment design, and so we're starting to take a look at either wintering those pairs in the dry lot or wintering those pairs on corn stalks, as I just discussed. So just to set it up for you real quick in terms of our overall treatment design or experiment design, just want to point out that this research, we have research replicated at 2 locations, okay? So there's ARDC, which is our location there at Meade in eastern Nebraska, just north of Lincoln. And then this PHREC is the Panhandle Research Station out in Scottsbluff, clear out on the west end of the state. So within each location, we've got the same treatments. Pairs were either managed in the dry lot or they were managed on corn stalks all winter long. I want to point out, though, that all these calves were not weaned until the end of March the following year. And so within each location, calves within each treatment were weaned at a common age. So I want to just describe to you just a little bit about the diets that we fed to the pairs that remained in the dry lot, and these are very similar diets as Rick pointed out yesterday in some of his discussions. And so we can see that we fed a diet that was a pretty high level of distillers grains. We fed at Meade or in eastern Nebraska, we fed a diet that was about 55% modified and 40% wheat straw, using wheat straw as our forage. At the Panhandle Station, we were using a wet product, conventional wet distillers grains, but had 40% wheat straw in that diet as well. And so very high energy, high protein diets, as you can see here, but they were limit fed, of course. And so when we look at our dry matter intakes for those pairs that remained in the dry lot, we pair fed them or obviously changed intakes accordingly at the same across those locations, so we had similar dry matter intakes across each location, right? Now, what we did in this study, though, is we actually increased our dry matter intake as the study advanced. And the reason we did that was to try to account for that increasing diet consumption from the calf at side. Now, these are summer-born, these are basically July-born calves. Average calving date in this system would be about July 15th. So these calves were close to 9 months of age before we weaned. So basically what we did is we have pretty good data on total amount of dry matter necessary to produce that calf up to about 205 days of age. So we just extended that basically for another 2 months in order to calculate how much to feed during that time period. So these intakes are a little bit higher than what we might normally anticipate. So we were a little over 27 pounds of dry matter per pair per day for those pairs that were in the dry lot. And again, that was from November through the end of March. Now, what our intentions were to target a supplementation rate for those cows that were on corn stalks that would provide an energy intake similar to what the pairs in the dry lot are consuming. Does that make sense? So that's pretty challenging to do because we don't have a measure of forage intake. That's extremely difficult to measure. But that was our objective, was to try to get a targeted similar energy intake between those pairs that were in the dry lot versus those pairs that were on corn stalks. But we obviously know what intake is and energy composition is of the pairs that are in confinement, and so that's pretty easy for us to measure on that end. But how we can accurately measure that on the other end with the pairs on stalks is a little bit more of a challenge, obviously, as many of you are very well aware of. But in terms of the supplement that we fed to the pairs on stalks, it was a pretty high level of distillers grains, basically a distillers grains based cube. We supplemented those pairs at about 5 pounds per pair per day on a dry matter basis. It averaged from about 3 to about 7, so it varied depending on month, but that would be per pair per day from November all the way through March. So let's take a look at some data. Let's see what the numbers look like. And so when we take a look at the cows at meat and there in eastern Nebraska, of course there's no difference in terms of initial body weight. When we look at ending body weights, we can see that we did have a significant difference between those treatments. Those pairs that remained in the dry lot, those cows that nursed a calf in the dry lot, were significantly heavier than those cows that grazed corn stalks all winter long, 1339 versus 1125. We can see, of course, no difference in terms of initial body weight for those cows out at the Panhandle station, but those cows that were managed in the dry lot were only slightly heavier than those that grazed corn stalks at the Panhandle station, 1307 versus 1271, but we didn't statistically pick it up within that just for those pairs that were at Panhandle. So saw a significant difference in terms of ending body weight at Meade, no difference in terms of ending body weight for those cows out at the Panhandle station. I think body weight change might be a little bit easier for you guys to visualize, but again, obviously, logically, those cows that were managed in the dry lot at Meade or in eastern Nebraska gained a fair amount of body weight during that time period. Those cows that grazed corn stalks lost a fair amount of body weight, pretty close to about 100 pounds during that time period. Body weight change for cows at Panhandle actually was statistically different, but those cows basically maintained. The cows in the dry lot gained a small amount of body weight, just a little bit more than the ones on corn stalks, but not a real big difference in terms of those treatments out at the Panhandle station, okay? Body condition score, we think, is probably the most important indicator of cow nutrition status, and so that's really what we want to hang our hat on is body condition score versus body weight. Obviously, no difference there in terms of initial body condition score between those two treatments at Meade. For the cows that were managed in the dry lot, ending body condition score was a 6 for those cows versus a 4.6 for those cows that ran on corn stalks all winter there in eastern Nebraska. When we look at the cows there in western Nebraska, of course, no difference in initial body condition score, or we also did not see a difference in ending body condition score as well. 5.2 for the cows on corn stalks versus a 5.4 for those cows that were managed in the dry lot as well. Body condition score change, again, just might be a little bit easier way to visualize it. Those cows at Meade in eastern Nebraska that were in the dry lot all winter long gained a half a unit of body condition versus those cows that were managed on corn stalks lost a full unit of body condition. And again, this is from November all the way through the end of March. Those cows at the Panhandle station basically maintained body condition regardless of which treatment that they were on. So we'll take a look at calf body weight. We'll take a look at calf performance. And so these calves were about 320 pounds at the start of the stock grazing period. Those calves that were weaned out of the dry lot were significantly heavier than those that were weaned off of corn stalks in eastern Nebraska. So 672 versus 558 for the dry lot calves versus the corn stalks calves. So we saw an interesting difference in terms of calf performance there. When we look at the calves weaned from the Panhandle station, again, no difference there in terms of initial body weight, but we actually did not see a difference in terms of ending body weight, regardless of which treatment that those calves were wintered on there at the Panhandle station. When we look at calf performance, just in terms of average daily gain, says the same thing, right? Those calves that were weaned out of the dry lot had increased average daily gain over versus those that were on corn stalks. Really no difference in terms of treatment, there for those calves that were weaned out of the Panhandle station. So we saw some interesting location interactions. So why? What do we think is going on here? I think a lot of the things we can first take a look at from this first year's data, really I think we'll give credit to Mother Nature. And by that I mean we had some pretty significant snowfall out there at the Panhandle station, ironically enough, right after we started the corn stalk grazing period. So I want to point out that we had some pretty wide differences in terms of number of grazing days between these locations. So in eastern Nebraska there at Meade, we grazed corn stalks for almost 160 days straight during that time period, which really couldn't have come together any better in terms of what you would normally expect on an average year. We grazed corn stalks from the beginning of November all the way until the middle of April. but we had some pretty significant snowfall out at the Panhandle station, and so we had to prematurely remove cattle from the cornstalk field there at the 1st of January, and so we had 2 short grazing periods combined. It was about 60 days. The reason this is very important is because when we think back to that graph that I indicated, the number of days that we graze corn stalks influences diet quality. So one thing that we're taking a look at here obviously that could be influencing some of these location effects is that for those cows that were out at the Panhandle station during that time period when they would have been grazing stalks, diet quality is very high. And then when we had to prematurely remove them from the field due to the significant weather that we were challenged with, those pairs got the same diet and the same dry matter intake as the pairs that were on the dry lot treatment. Okay, we tried to hold that as constant as we can. So that obviously is going to influence what kind of response we see in terms of body condition score and body weight change. So that's a pretty interesting response that we observed. But I think also at the same time too, this is a really good example that just shows the variability that can exist in Nebraska from a year-to-year basis. At one location in the western part of the state, you get snowed out and we have extremely high snowfall, challenging conditions. At the other location, you can graze stocks for 150 days out of the year, which makes a huge difference when we look, as Rick talked about yesterday, when we look at our overall economics, that really has a big impact on this. So obviously grazing corn stalks is extremely economical for us. You're still at the mercy of Mother Nature, especially in Nebraska, and so that's going to influence that as well. I thought the discussion we had with Dr. Sawyer just before the break really ties into this very well as well. So what kind of influence are we having on maintenance energy requirements of these cows when we put these cows on a limit-fed diet? And obviously what kind of influence do we have on maintenance energy requirements do we have when we just pen those cows up just from the decrease in requirements due to activity for grazing? So there's several things going on here. I also thought the discussion with regards to visceral organ size was very appropriate. I find that very interesting. So in this situation, those cows, obviously they were on a limit-fed diet. They went to the corn stalk field, and we didn't do a transition period, if you will, in order to maybe try to adapt them. Whether or not those cows need to adapt, that's a question. I'm not sure I'm not necessarily sure that needs to happen, but it's an important thing that I think we need to discuss and talk about. Obviously, what the digestibility differences are between a grazed and a limit-fed diet. So as I indicated, we tried to target that energy level the same between those 2 treatments within each location. I think there's a lot of things going on there that maybe have influenced our estimates, and we can obviously see that when we look at the big interactions we had there due to location. What are cow pregnancy rates like, at least from this one experiment that we did? Just want to point out that across those 4 treatments, our overall pregnancy rates for all 4 of those groups were quite well, anywhere from 90 to 100% for a couple of groups. Just want to point out there, of course, that's a limited number of females. You obviously need a lot more numbers to add into that on a yearly basis, and we're going to replicate these treatments over the next 2 years. So as these data continue to come together, that'll I think we'll be able to have a lot more confidence in that. But at least from this first year, those cows bred up just fine. So I want to take a look at just a couple of things related to residue utilization and how it might influence subsequent corn and bean yields. And so this is a pretty big issue that I think a lot of people ask. A big question a lot of people ask is, what influence does grazing corn stalks have on subsequent corn and soybean yields? These are some data that Mary Janowski analyzed and put together for us. This is from a single field that's in eastern Nebraska that's been managed in a corn and soybean rotation for the last 10 years. And so within every year, there are 3 treatments that are applied to that field, and they're applied to the same areas consecutively. So there's a portion of the field that is not grazed, and then there's 2 other portions of the field that are either grazed in the spring or grazed in the fall. And when we look at it, on average across 10 years, and again, and this is also under irrigation as well, but we can see that grazing versus not grazing has not had an impact on corn yields, and it's not had an impact on soybean yields either. but actually fall grazing slightly improved soybean yields from this single field, and again, that's over 10 years. So I think that's a pretty strong data set that shows that at least under irrigation in eastern Nebraska, we don't really seem to have an influence on subsequent corn and bean yields. This is the same, or another set of data that's just real similar to that, only this is under continuous corn production. This would be an irrigated field in western Nebraska. And so when we look at comparing either not grazing those corn stalks or grazing at either one or two different stalking rates versus baling, for continuous corn under irrigation in western Nebraska, those different residue removal treatments have not had an influence on corn grain yield. Now I just want to point out to kind of wrap this up this morning that there are some different companies, equipment manufacturing companies that are looking at some different alternative methods of harvesting the residue. And their goal with this is to improve the overall residue quality. And by doing that, they're able to do that through influencing the proportion of those plant parts that are harvested. So that's why I wanted to set up that time at the beginning talking about the quality of those different components or parts of the plant. That's exactly what the objective is with these different harvesting technologies. This first system over here on the left basically utilizes a baler that's pulled behind the combine as you go down through the field, and so it's a single pass system that does not stop. And so the tailings that come from the straw walker or from the spreader there on the end of the combine go directly into that baler. And so that baler continuously produces bales, and that combine never stops. And so that's a bale that has a higher proportion of husk and leaf material that's in that bale. Another system here that's actually being developed by the New Holland Manufacturing Company. It's basically an alternative corn head, and the objective with it is to basically influence the number of rows that go into the windrow from the combine. And so you have all the tailings that fall down from the combine, but then you influence the number of rows that the whole stock material goes into the windrow here. So they're basically just influencing the plant components in that windrow by influencing the number of rows that are cut that go into that windrow is basically what the idea there is. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this technology comes to fruition on a more commercial basis, but I just want to point out that it is in the works, and it may influence how we harvest and how we think about harvesting residue as we go down the road and take a look at it in the future. I just want to point out some data. These are some digestibility data that were completed at Nebraska here recently, utilizing residue that was harvested from that New Holland system that I just discussed. And so what we're comparing here is conventionally raked and baled corn stalks versus those residue bales that were produced from either 8-row, 6-row, 4-row, or 2-row bales that were produced versus total husk material. So I just want to point out that we can see we get an increase, and these are organic matter digestibility. It's just a proxy of energy availability. We can see that increases as the number of rows decreases as we harvest those higher quality plant components. So I think some really interesting data that might influence how we harvest residue and the quality of that residue that we harvest as we look into the future. I think our take-home message from our group at Nebraska is extremely simple. Residue is a huge component of our production systems in Nebraska. It's growing, it's becoming more abundant. We're not growing the sandhills, we're not putting acres back into native rangeland production, and so for us, for the beef cattle industry to continue to become efficient and grow, obviously we're going to have to look at alternative methods to utilize these resources that we have available to us. As Rick talked about yesterday, and from the data that I just described to you, the main thing we're looking at now is basically going to an alternative system where we dry lot cows during the summer and utilize those stocks during the winter. And so that's the idea that we want to take a look at. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of factors that influence the economics of that, but in most situations, our numbers would suggest that can be a pretty viable model for us. The main thing here for us is to just think about how you can build a production system around the resources that you have. So no matter where you're located, if you're in the Southern Plains, Northern Plains, regardless of where your location is, the main take-home message here is to look at the resources that you have around you and build your system accordingly. For us in the Northern Plains, it's going to probably be related to corn residue. That's a huge component for us. In the Southern Plains, it's probably going to be a wheat pasture, grain sorghum type of a system. So that's the idea for us from Nebraska. Appreciate your attention. As Rick mentioned yesterday, beef.unl.edu. A lot of good resources for everyone to access there, and I encourage you to take a look at that for more information. I'd be happy to take any questions, Dr. Berger, if you have any at this time.
Questions? The mic's coming.
Your decreasing digestibility, your cornstalk residue, is that a function of decay or selective grazing?
Mostly a function of selective grazing. Yep.
Pass it to Dave there. Yeah.
First a comment, then a question for you, Jason. One of the things we've done, because we do have some confined housing and we do bed new calves at arrival, is we've gone to cob carts. You know, you showed a baler behind a combine. There's also a cob cart application that separates that roughage, and we found that what it leaves in the windrow is higher quality, and we've got the cob to bed with, we've got the cob to do some other things with. So we've adapted some of that technology a little bit differently than what you showed. My question is, have you looked at rotation through a cornfield or time of year that you open that cornfield to cattle, and does that change the availability of leaf and husk, and does that change the digestibility of those things?
To answer your question first, in terms of rotating, yes. And so actually what we did in that study that I described, we switched to a different field about, I guess, 2/3 of the way through the grazing season. So we've got, like at Mead in eastern Nebraska, we've got an area that we graze initially in the fall. And so we would graze that from November all the way up until the end of January, and then we would go to a spring grazed area, or go to a new set of rows during the spring graze that we graze on for February and March, basically. So in this, and we actually, the second time we went to corn stalks at the Panhandle station, we also went to a different field. So we're accounting for that when we're trying to account for how much energy those pairs are picking up in terms of what they're grazing and what their diet quality is. So yes, we're trying to rotate, or we are rotating in that fashion. In terms of overall diet quality between if you graze it initially versus grazing it at the end, I think initially we would say no, there should not be a large difference there. There might be some differences in terms of availability if there's losses due to wind or something like that. There might be some lost residue availability in terms of amount, but quality should not change dramatically, no.
Have you looked at residue left from earlage? You've got a lot more plant left in the field.
Right. Earlage is another interesting one. I think probably needs to be taken a look at. We've not done a lot of work on that recently with our group, but it's definitely one where yeah, you can increase the quality of that by leaving more material, and so yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
What about your calf body weight slide that we, you were in the dry lot 672 pounds or whatever, and on the corn stalk program 5 something, do you have correlation of profitability? That 600 pound calf, everybody likes that number, but was the corn stalk process system so much cheaper that weaning that 530 pound or whatever the number was it enough cheaper that you're actually more profitable with that smaller calf?
So I need to run the numbers on specifically those two differences that you're talking about, but what Rick showed you yesterday where we've looked at that difference between those different systems, for the total dry lot system, we were basing that off of weaning calves at an average of basically 7 months of age. So our data to this point would suggest that at a 7 month of age weaning weight, we're right at just a little under 500 pounds, about 480 in terms of weaning weight. That's what Rick would have showed yesterday. In this study, you got to remember we weaned them about 2 months later, so they were a couple months older at that time point. What we've put in for the combination dry lot winter graze stocks system, the weaning weight that we would have initially put in when we did our economic analysis actually is pretty close to the weaning weights of those calves when they came off that system this past year at about 560 pounds or so. So you're right, that's obviously going to have a huge impact on it as well. But when we initially did those economic comparisons, we were comparing weaning calves at 7 months of age out of the dry lot versus weaning calves maybe at 9 months of age out of the residue field. But we wanted to wean them all at the same age in this particular study to get a good handle on what calf performance is between those two differences or those two treatments. So yeah.
Do you have an idea of how much the corn stalks, like cost per cow per year, the dry lot, I mean, and his data probably yesterday showed, and I don't have that on the top of my mind right now, but what are you looking at? How much savings on a cost per cow per year with the corn stalk system, and especially that 160 day? That's a really long period. You see where I'm going with that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, if you look at it, if you say, well, okay, if you're going to a situation where somebody's providing full care and labor, you might be 50 or 60 cents a cow a day in terms of cost per head per day with corn stalks versus if you're, maybe $1.25 or whatever during that time period in the dry lot. It's a huge difference, $200-300 difference maybe in an annual cow budget. So yeah.
Any health differences in the dry lot calves versus the corn stock?
Not in this study. No, we didn't see a difference between those two groups there. No.
Suppose you have 160 acres, a quarter section that'll handle 200 cows, just pick a figure, or 100 cows. Are you better off grazing the whole field or dividing it in half and doubling the number on half of it and then cleaning it up and then going to the second half?
Jason, why don't you repeat the question?
So Dr. Ng asked about if I understand your question correctly, so if you've got a certain size field, are you better off to basically split that field in half and graze more intensively on one half versus?
Double your numbers on one half and use it and then move to the next half, or do you just turn them into the whole field?
Right. Well, it really kind of depends. If you turn them, obviously if you turn them into the whole field, those cows are going to have a better opportunity to select a higher quality diet if your stocking rate's a little bit lower. But on the other hand, though, too, if you want to, you can still get around that or mitigate that if you graze more intensively, double stock basically, let's say, and then if you appropriately move to another field or you do that often enough, you're not going to see a decline. If you do that before you get into a situation where you're seeing a decline in diet quality, that can work there as well too. So
which would you do if you had?
I do like the idea of moving on a regular basis, as you described. I think in a lot of situations, if you're set up correctly, that can work very well. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Let's thank Jason.